This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound. Hi, Judaism. How unbound are you? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg. Rena Yehuda Newman is also here today, and two of our friends, Xava de Cordova and Michael Sokolovsky, are also here. This is an incredible format of episode where we're combining forces with our friends at Chai, How Are You? That's Chai with an X, X-A-I, How Are You? Longtime friends of Judaism Unbound. They've been on our podcast. We've been on theirs. It's a lovely back and forth. And today we move it from back and forth to, synchronous, same time and forth. We joined them for a conversation about Nazarites. They've been doing a set of episodes diving into this ancient Jewish vow called the Nazarite vow. If you haven't heard of it, that's okay. It's a little bit of an esoteric thing from the Book of Numbers that then gets expanded upon in the Talmud and later on. It's this really interesting vow that one can take where you abstain from cutting your hair, from grape products, and from contact with dead bodies. It's a whole thing. We promise it's really interesting, and it's especially interesting to get to glean wisdom from Xava and Michael, who have their own deep thoughts about Nazarite vows that we get to sort of hop into and bring our Judaism Unbound lens. So without further ado, enjoy this bonus episode. Here's Hi Judaism. How unbound are you?
Michael.
Hi, Ava. How are you?
Hi. Hi. How am I, you say?
Yeah.
Baruch Hashem, I'm decent. I was like pretty crummy until both my coffee and Adderall kicked in about 5 minutes before we started recording. And now a new brain is in the place where my previous crummy brain was, and I'm doing pretty decently.
That sounds nice.
Just sort of like, overwhelmed, preparing for the high holidays. Yeah, that's what's on my brain right now. Michael, what's on your brain? Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm wrapped in a blanket because I'm cold.
Thank God.
Yeah.
It's cold?
Yeah.
That's not my experience of the weather right now, but we are in somewhat different places.
Ooh, we are. Yeah. I turn off the heat in the building that I record when I record with you, because it makes a noise, and now I need to start doing the blanket
Yeah, I
thing.
feel like where I am, it's not cold enough to have had the heat on in the first place. That's what's perplexed me.
Also, there are two people spying on our conversation.
It's true. There are two non-us's in the room today, and those two people are Lex Rofberg and Rena Yehuda Newman. Who are you? Tell the listeners about yourselves.
Wait a second. I prepared for Hi, how are you? I was totally thrown by who are you, even though it's the same three letters scrambled. WHO.
Well,
see what I did there?
yeah.
H-O-W. But
Yeah.
okay, we can do who are you? Hi. I strive by the end of this conversation for the four of us to be us. I hope that we won't remain separate from your us. That's tough to hear, but I understand we can aspire to get there. I am a visitor in the past to this wonderful podcast, Hi, How Are You? And also co-host with somebody who's not here, Dan Levinson of Judaism Unbound, one of y'all's neighbors in the pod-osphere. I'm also talking to our people at Judaism Unbound, and so for them, like, Judaism Unbound is the home base, and y'all are the folks external to the us. We're totally upending all of the norms of podcasting. It's really spectacular and very interesting, I swear. But I'm Lex, senior Jewish educator at Judaism Unbound, lover of Chai, How Are You? I'm hearing the music that y'all play in my head right now at the beginning.
Open your Bibles.
Yes, exactly. Who are you, Rena Yehuda?
Who am I? My name is Rena Yehuda. I got two first names. I use they, them pronouns. And I am the director of the certificate program in Unbound Judaism at Judaism Unbound's Yeshiva program. So I have the delight of organizing all the different cohorts and students that we have who are going through our certificate program and putting their flag on the map of unbound Jewish thinking and unbound Jewish doing and moving and shaking. I'm also a comics artist and a writer, and I do all kinds of creative things outside of my life within Judaism Unbound. And it's really exciting to get to combine podcasting energies and get to meet both of you. Thanks for having us on.
Oh, yeah. I love that in your intro you said, I have two first names. I use they, them pronouns because like it's clear that those two things are linked. It's a very non-binary energy to be like, I have two first names and this is why.
Look, you got to clarify the double barrel thing. I think we're living, in a United States context, people are confused about the two first names, except for From people. From people
Right.
know about the double barrel
Right.
first name, but it's a very queer two first names. So,
Right. Right. So we're here to talk about Nazarite stuff. As Hightower you listeners will know, for the past at least month and a half, Michael and I have been working our way right through Mishnah Nazir as part of an experiment with how we make our podcast and just sort of taking it as it comes. And as we've been working our way through, Lex has been live tweeting me his takes, his disagreements.
I no longer use X, or to be clear, I've been live bothering you via Messenger.
Yeah, I mean it's not live tweeting, but like the activity is still live tweeting, even if none of the contents are tweets.
Oh yeah, it's one of those. There's like a name for those words that are. It's like when people say Rolodex, but they don't mean the
or
literal
Band-Aid.
thing. Yeah,
exactly. So you've been doing that because you have a lot of feelings and opinions about Nazariteship, and so does Rena Yehuda. Why do you have those? Why do you care?
Wonderful question. Yes, so in many ways, sort of my awakening to Jewish learning was most, energized, inspired by my encounter with Jewish vows. So with Nedarim being the broad umbrella of Jewish vows, and then Nazarite vow being sort of the most in-depth explored type of vow with the most kind of rules and particular regulations in the Mishnah and Talmud and later texts. I was navigating my way through the Mishnah, the whole thing in college. I did like a chapter a day in English. I didn't have much Hebrew at the time. Of the entire text, the section on vows most excited me because it struck me as basically a way for us to all be Jewish sorcerers and craft our own Jewish regulations and reality. Like it's a way that through verbal speech we can say stuff, and like the status of me in the universe is actually transformed according to God, at least like in the traditional sense of what a vow does. And like that's cool. It's like abracadabra, but in a ancient and official Jewish sense. And I also felt from the get-go that it is, at least in potential, a very radical act, and I like radical Jewish acts. The reason for that is that basically, and you see this in the Talmud, and you all have explored this a little bit in the episodes I've heard, it's a way for people to not need rabbis as intermediaries so much for their relationship with the divine. It's a way for them to just take a vow, make themselves a certain kind of Jew, in this case a Nazarite, and like the rabbis don't seem to like that. They have all sorts of stuff in the Talmud about nullifying those vows, about making them not exist. Eventually that leads many, many centuries later to the annual declaration Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur, which nullifies all vows, or at least attempts to. When rabbis are really opposed to something Jewishly, even though I am a rabbi, I tend to be interested in why, and I usually end up liking whatever it is that they're opposed to, because I am called towards Jewish things that empower folks who are not rabbis, and this is one of them. So that wasn't so much about like Nazarite, the three stringencies of it. What I will say on that front is I have taken a Nazarite vow twice myself for 30 days each time, and it has been a meaningful experience. And I wrote my final teshuvah, my final paper in rabbinical school on what it would look like to revive the Nazarite vow in particular today. But Rena Yehuda, you've got a relationship to Nazarite too.
I do. And it was such a delight in our sort of weekly schmoozing that Lex and I do for our work at Judaism Unbound to realize that we actually have this deep passion for the Torah of vows in common. I think my introduction, or like the thing that really got me thinking about vows, both Nazarite and beyond, I was in Berlin a number of years ago, and I had Shabbos lunch with a comrade of mine named Avinoam Stillman. And I remember that he delivered this drosh, I suppose, like a teaching over Shabbos lunch. It was ahead of Tisha B'Av, and the teaching was that when we observe Tisha B'Av, we're not just grieving the destruction of the temple, but we're also grieving the fact that we can no longer make vows and oaths to each other because the temple was where we went to sanctify and to break those vows and oaths.
Break in the sense of complete them. Like, that's what you meant by to break the vows and oaths, right?
Well, and also if you need to get out of a vow, you have to bring a sacrifice. So in order to end that vow,
yeah, that's what I mean. Not like to go against the rules of the vow is what I was getting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In order to complete it or have it be finished, you have to go to the temple. You have to make a sacrifice. And now, in absence of that temple, the muscle that we collectively used to have in making vows and oaths to each other has atrophied, and we no longer know how to do it. And that there's like a great sadness in the world now because it changes the fundamental nature of what our relationships are to each other and what's possible. That we live under late capitalism, we live in a world in which it's like there are like 5 relationships that you're allowed to have, and that's like parent, child, sibling, boss, and or employee / maybe coworker and friend if you're very lucky. And that's the extent of human relationships that we can have in this system.
Did you say spouse?
Oh, I guess, yeah, maybe spouse, right? Legally married, one heterosexual monogamous spouse. That's what we're allowed within the system. And the concept of making vows to one another means that we can create relationships that actually bind us in really significant ways that also lack legibility to the current system and are also deeply, deeply intimate and about really who we are because they're through the power of choice. And so I've been thinking about this teaching since it was given over, and it's really expanded so much of the way that I see human relationships, especially within a halachic or a Jewish context, and thinking like how much more so if when on Tisha B'Av we think about the destruction of the temple, and we often say that bringing Mashiach means the rebuilding of the temple or having the third temple, that actually part of what brings Mashiach and what brings redemption in Geula is actually about rebuilding our ability to have these kinds of free-form, creative, and meaningful relationships with one another. So that's been kind of the cornerstone of my thinking about vows. And Nazirite vows are like the one kind of vow that we've got like a ton of information on. Everything else seems to be like a whole bunch of question marks. But I think it's as Lex said, I think it's a pretty radical way into thinking about human relationships, and especially those human relationships as being deeply sanctified through a kind of commitment that really brings holiness or Kedusha into the picture.
Whoa, that's cool. It makes me sad about Nazirite vows, though, because like a Nazirite vow is a very, it doesn't involve other people, really. It involves yourself and God. It would be kind of cool if there were standardized relationship. Like imagine a Nazirite vow that was like a Havruta situation where you both have to go in for 30 days together. That would be kind of interesting. You and your bosom buddy can be Nazirite bosom buddies together or something like that. It makes me think that the appeal in my mind to explore Nazirite vows is maybe was initially misguided. It's an escape from reality, a way to cloister yourself as opposed to a way to create new relationships with vows. That's a lot more difficult and more cool, it seems more right to me in this moment, what you're saying, Rena Yehuda.
All of that is really compelling reasons for Nazirite vows to be interesting. I mean, I really vibe with what you said, Rena Yehuda, about like the importance of our ability to sort of like make and fulfill agreements with each other as human beings. That was like a big part of my journey around deciding to get married, was sort of just like accepting that like it was important to have a ritual that sort of affirmed that we need to be able to like make promises to each other and keep them. And that's sort of like fundamental to what we're doing on earth. Like if we can't do that, then like what are we really up to here?
It was a great ritual. It was really holy and awesome. Shouts to you.
Lex was there.
Michael was there too.
Michael was there too. Yes. Everyone but Rena and Yehuda. So you really missed out.
I was there in spirit. You didn't know it, but I was there.
Okay, great. But also part of this deal is like, at least you, Lex, are of the opinion that the rabbis are sort of trying to marginalize Nazirite vows and maybe vows as a whole. So like 2 questions, one of which is like, why do you think that? Like, what is your evidence? And 2, why do you think that is? Like, why are they doing that?
Yeah. So part of the why I think that is this is a sidestep to start, but folks that have written about rabbinic relationship to Nazarites in like Jewish studies circles, they've influenced me a lot on this, and they point out that it's really wild and disproportionate the amount of time within first the Mishnah on Nazarite, but then later, I mean, Nazarite and Nedarim, the broader vow section. It's really wild how much of it is devoted to ways you would find loopholes out of it. And I'm saying loopholes not as a pejorative. That's like literally the Hebrew. Like the word is petach, like an opening, a hole that retroactively makes a vow that you took not count. And so the reason why that's interesting is that in the Bible, it is very clear that you cannot break vows, even if it means somebody is going to die. You can't break a vow. There is no retroactive intent that you like could have sort of not thought of where you would be able to say, oh, that vow didn't count. Because in the book of Judges, Jephthah has a daughter, and Jephthah is going to war and says, hey, if I win this battle, God, I commit to you, I make a vow that I will sacrifice to you the first something that comes out of my house. Turns out the first something, he's probably envisioning an animal. The first something is his daughter, which the fact that she's sort of a what in this situation is itself patriarchal and problematic, obviously. But he has to kill her. There's no, oh, Jephthah didn't think of it, and so we can take it out. But the rabbis create one. They, from ex nihilo, they create this idea that if you didn't sort of consider the consequences of your vow in the first place, whatever kind of vow, whether it's a Nazarite vow or something else, then you can look back at the way you took it at the beginning, you can find a way out of it, and it doesn't count. They do this for chapter upon chapter, and then they really sort of crescendo it over time, and eventually it leads to kol nidre, which nullifies all vows, first in the past tense, but then even in the future tense. That's sort of the 1,000+ year history of vows. So they really want to get these out of Jewish society. The other reason I'd offer that they do that, or that I think they're doing that, is that look at what happened with, say, prayer. We have 3 prayers a day. The reason for that is that there was precedent in the temple for thrice daily offerings, and they transmuted those offerings into prayer. They said, oh, we're not doing sacrifices at the temple anymore. We're still going to have something called mincha, though. It's just going to be a prayer service now. With vows, they didn't do that. They could have very easily looked and said, people are taking vows. There's a problem because at the end of those vows, they have to give offerings at the temple. Well, instead of giving offerings at the temple, they'll do a prayer service. They'll do like an intense davening. They didn't say that. That would be identical as sort of a creative act. It's not more interesting or innovative or whatever than what they did with prayer. They chose not to. And over again, we see that rabbis were sort of antagonistic to those taking vows because they saw them as sort of ignoramuses, am haaretz, weren't thinking through what they were doing. We see that both in halachic texts and sort of in other spaces. And so that's sort of why I think they're doing it. The charitable reason for why they would want to is that they're worried about these people's like fate. If you take a vow and you mess up, you don't have the ability to bring a sacrifice and atone for it. So you're just kind of in a ritual purgatory. And so you could say the rabbis don't want people to end up in that place. I have a more cynical read, which is that rabbis in all eras have wanted to have control over ritual life, and they have not historically wanted people to be able to shape it themselves. And we see that today with people creating things outside of rabbinic institutional spaces. Rabbis are often not happy about it. And I think this is an example of that.
Well, I have big disagreement, which is wild to be the defender of institutional power structures within my life. I mean, not total defender, but I'll just say, like, you're right. Like, the rabbis, I mean, there's this really beautiful phrase when they introduce the idea of nullification of vows that they say in Talmud that they're porchin ba'avir, like literally they're blossoming forth from the nothingness. And I think one of the reasons that they may not have transmuted this ritual in the same way that they did with prayer is because they were in the process of sort of creating this new thing called the halachic process, which, like, in its best incarnation can be sort of a communal way of creating collective law that transcends time and space. And the communal aspect of that is important, and individuals creating their own halakhically binding vows is sort of in competition with that. Not inherently, but I think there is that's one of the tensions that they were concerned about, is like if the halakhic process is prohibiting things and then other people are prohibiting other things, it sort of like dilutes the power of that process. I'm not saying that's the best and most wonderful solution they could have taken, but I'm saying that I think we did get something like pretty decent out of the bargain, and it wasn't necessarily like a completely selfish, like me, like Rabban Gamliel should have all this power. I mean, maybe Rabban Gamliel, he kind of sucked, but
I don't mean it that way. I just mean that when I hear you say what you just said, it feels to me like just a call for conformity. Like you're giving a really generous, beautiful understanding of it. It feels to me like they want people to adhere to a system they came up with, and they believe in the goodness of that system. It's not because they hate people or have malice.
I'll let other people say things before I just get into an eternal back and forth.
I mean, I think I come at it from sort of a third angle, and I do tend to agree with Lex on the part of it that is, regardless of what the intention of the rabbis of the era in terms of eliminating vows or making them harder to come by without creating kind of an amendment of like, we can just, like we bring the korban, like we bring the sacrifice of words and we turn that into words, why don't we just have something like that for vows? They really wanted them out. I think it's sort of a difference of thinking about vows as being deeply individual versus being collective. It was interesting, Michael, when you responded to what I said at the beginning about my interest of vows, that you were saying, I've thought about the Nazirite vows as being an escape from reality and a thing that individuals are sort of doing to opt out of a system or to be elsewhere or to disassociate from society or the community, when in fact I think actually the structure of vows is about connecting one to a new and maybe substructure community within a given place and within a given society. And I think about it, part of what my interest in vows has to do with the way that my queer relationships work, that I have all kinds of different relationships in my life, and that there's a way that when we say, actually, this matters to me, in a way that culturally we think that maybe it shouldn't or doesn't, or I want to make an oath and commitment to this person who otherwise I would actually never be connected to it were I not on Grindr for that night, right? Like, were I not in this subculture that connects me to people vis-a-vis, in my case, sometimes sex. That there's a way that I know people through a completely different lens than is often seen as being socially acceptable. And actually the ties that bind me to those people matter greatly in my life. And so vows being a free-form structure and not just a wedding vow, but vows that go beyond that into all kinds of other relationships are actually a way that you can tie a society together through means that are not often otherwise recognized as legitimate. And that actually creates social webbing and social networks that go beyond perhaps what the rabbis could control. And so there is the really uncharitable read of the rabbis saying that they actually want to crush all of that. And I think in my more antinomian takes, I tend to side there. But there's also a piece of it that's actually just about being able to recognize what our real relationships are when they don't have a culturally acceptable label. And so being against vows or not wanting vows to be a part of how we do things within halacha, I don't think it's this sort of selfish, individualistic way of approaching things. I think it's actually about trying to create a social structure that undergirds everything in the society in which individuals are deeply connected to one another, not simply an abstinence that removes people from the greater culture as a whole.
I would love to hear about some examples where you've used vows in ways that we wouldn't necessarily think of ourselves or are a little bit unexpected for most people.
I'll be brief. I would point on that front to, there's a category of vows that the rabbis talk almost nothing about. I think they might be most threatened by this one, but maybe not. I don't know. They don't talk about it much. It's mentioned among the 7 types of vows in Kol Nidre called Charame. So when you say Kol Nidre Vesare Vacharame, that one, it sounds like harem, which is appropriate. And I don't know linguistically if it connects to the notion of a harem, but it is a group vow made together. That's basically all we know about it because the rabbis didn't go into it beyond that. And that does seem to have been a way that groups of people could collectively assert something, some commitment that they're sharing with one another through that word charame. And so we have that precedent. There's like nothing about practically how it was mobilized anywhere. For the reasons that y'all identified, would, if we were reviving vow practices today, which I'm interested in, that's one that I would really be jazzed about, because I think there are issues with the Nazirite vow specifically, and with some categories of vows where they are, I mean, Nazir in modern Hebrew is often, it's translated as like monk. It's the same word as, it's like, it's understood as like, go off and be separate, which I don't actually think it was. Like Yehuda said, I think there were many people taking Nazirite vows that once they took them would interact with one another, and it was a way to have a temporary period of a certain kind of community. And then once you leave, sort of re-enter into the broader community. Both are communal collective acts, but I acknowledge that there are some sort of individualistic tendencies we should be aware of.
And I think in my personal life, I think about many of the people who matter to me. And my partner and I, or my husband and I should say, we did get married this past year, legally, right before the inauguration, because we do have a transatlantic relationship. He and I like to think about our relationships as being constellations. And there are many people inside of this constellation, and it creates a shape when you have different people in different places, and those stars shine brightly and in different colors and connect to one another in different ways. When I think about it through that framework, the concept of making vows feels really important, because my husband is not the only person who I want to take vows to. My husband is not the only person in my life who I feel very, very seriously committed to. And actually, many of these other relationships are things that allow me to be more committed to him. And the love that he gives me allows me to be more committed to these other relationships. I mean, I have a friend named Meg, who I often affectionately refer to as my mom, dad. This is somebody who, when I was really like coming of age and was living in a co-op in Madison, Wisconsin, and this was somebody who I met at that time, who's 25 years older than me, and we have a lot in common in terms of our gender expression, except she's, again, 25 years older than me and is like a butch dyke who like never did anything about pronouns, and also identifies with transness in a way that I do. It's that there's all these parallels, and she's someone who really took care of me and really helped me grow at this age, and is somebody who is one of the most important spiritual chavrutas I have ever had. And from that place, and because of the nature of that relationship, this is somebody who I want to take vows to. This is somebody who matters so much to me, who I want to take care of when she's older, who I feel committed to as her son. And I think about the ways in which in queer relationships or in kink relationships or in non-monogamous relationships, there's all of these different textures of sort of unlabeled commitments, and a structure that is as sacred as taking vows, and something that is as ancient and is actually part of a lineage and tradition that says people who are not in traditional relationships with one another can matter to each other. That feels very interesting to me, because I think if we don't have commitments to one another, that's actually how, the great war machine and the great systems that we're in atomize us and make us weaker. That's an example from my personal life about where I feel like a vows practice might be useful for me. But I think about, classically David and Jonathan, right? They take an oath to each other. And a lot of times I think we overwrite that story as being like simply a gay relationship. But as somebody who really loves history, like I think that's anachronistic. Not because I think there isn't a queerness there, but because the thing that they're doing actually, because it is from a different historical era, is so important and is so significant and exists on its own terms as its own things. We can't actually map it one-to-one to, it was just a modern gay relationship and they couldn't get gay married, so they did this instead. No, they have a unique relationship that's really, really special, and they take an oath to describe exactly what that is, does, and means to them. And they had access to this religious and holy system of binding their lives to one another that allowed them to express it, I think actually perhaps better than we can under the frameworks that we have access to today. And that's why I love vows.
Yeah, that's a great pitch for vows.
Xava, keep pushing back though. Like I think this episode is most valuable if you give why vows should be understood with caution.
Well, I'm open to a vow renaissance, but I just want to say, like Lex, you were saying, like one of the things you think the rabbis wanted was conformity. I just don't think it's fair to characterize the situation that way, because at least in Mishnah Nazir, which is what we've mostly talked about on our pod, Tannaitic era, the rabbis are not in broad societal power in terms of people following their halachic system. And so I think of them much more in sort of like equal competition with sort of other systems rather than already on top, sort of assimilating people into their existing system. And the temple is still quite fresh for people. So they're both trying to think, what are the other sort of existing spiritual practices that we need to figure out whether we're going to bring with us or not bring with us? And also, how can we both take what we need from the temple, but also encourage people to leave the temple behind, right? And to me, I think the agenda around vows I feel a little more friendly to it if I think of it that way, because, as we get into later eras, Amoraic era, and then on up until now, like obviously that decision that the Tannaitic, the Mishnah era rabbis made feels very different in terms of its power relationship, because halacha and the rabbis have a much more authoritative role in Jewish culture writ large than they did when they were making those decisions. And so it makes perfect sense that we might want to have a rebellion or a renaissance against their take on vows. I'm just not sure that their agenda was so hegemonic.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. I mean, to the extent that rabbinic antagonism to vows exists in history, it certainly is much bigger later. I think you're right that to some degree, I'm taking what happened later with rabbinic relationships to vows and retrojecting it onto Mishnah. I do think there's a sliver, but like I'm down to like I think that we've got a good common ground there.
I think you're right that there's a sliver. I think the picture in the Mishnah is quite multivocal. We just covered Mishnah 1 of chapter 2 in Mishnah Nazir, which is a really fun one. It's about what if you vow, I'm a Nazirite with regards to figs and fig cakes, which for those of you who know things about Nazirite vows, like they have nothing to do with fig cakes. And Hillel is basically like, forget about that. That's nothing. And Shammai is like, no, like that is a vow.
But they're adjacent. They're getting that figs are like sorta-ish close to grapes.
Well, this is what I'm saying is that Shammai, I think, is giving some respect to the intentions of the parts of this vow, right? Shammai's position is basically like, you have said some things that are potential vows, and I'm going to take you at your word and make those binding vows. And Hillel is like, unless the whole thing is a sensical package, like we're discarding your vow. Hillel, I think, much more reflects the sort of like anti-vow tendency that will become the halachic truth.
Totally.
But Shammai, in this case, feels like the much more people-friendly, which is rare for Shammai, take that like actually does listen to people. So I think there is in the Mishnah, like in all rabbinic texts, like a multivocality. Like it is not a universal anti-vow front. There actually is some nuance there that we can draw upon.
Super accept that, especially as somebody who lights 2 different menorahs on Hanukkah, one according to Shammai's system of starting with all the candles and going down a night, and one with Hillel's where you start with one and go up, because I often actually find myself vibing with Shammai for the reasons I said before, which is that I struggle with many of the rabbinic choices that became the winners later on, and those are often Hillel's, and Shammai often represents sidelined ideas of what we might be doing. Also, Shammai is an asshole sometimes. Like I'm not here to say Shammai is the best, but like, yeah, I super accept that. What I'd say on it is maybe it's worth just like dwelling in some of the specifics of the Nazirite vow. Like the what of it is really interesting, right? Like we haven't asked like, why are these 3 things linked? Like, okay, so you grow out your hair, you don't shave it. You don't consume grape products. Most commonly Jewish associated grape product being wine, but also whatever grape products. And you're not able to interact with dead bodies, the cemetery or otherwise. So like what happens? Why are those grouped together? And again, influenced by work that others have done on this, I think that there's a way that this is kind of a pathway for people to be priest-esque without being priests. And that's part of the seed of why I'm really all about it, because we do have this hierarchy that is part of the halachic system that is just about who you're born to. I mean, there's the classic joke about, I really want to be a Kohen, I really want to be a priest. Like, Rabbi, how can I be one? And the rabbi's like, you can't become one, sorry. And the person responds like, oh my gosh, that's so awful to hear because my father was a priest and his father was a priest. So that person is a priest. But like, I like that there is a pathway for people who are not already granted a status that is elite to say some words and in certain senses become adjacent to that. So that is part of what calls me to it. I acknowledge that this particular vow being sort of best known vow, it steers us away from the kinds that Rena Yehuda is talking about that really are super focused on like the ways that modern folks tend to think about like wedding vows to a person. That's not what most of the Jewish literature about vows is. I think we could make it part of our system.
There's a lot to go into there, but I just want to say the way that you phrase that, which I had never really thought about Nazirite vows as sort of like a way to make yourself priest-like, just like another great point in my column for why it made sense that the rabbis wanted to distance themselves from this, because they're trying to say, forget about priests, people, no more priests, no more temple, like stop. We have got to do something new now.
That comes from the Bible, by the way, that like that's a rabbinic take, not a scholarly take, which is that the priestly blessing comes right connected to the section on, I forget if it's Nazirite vows or broader vows, but they're like adjacent to each other. So the rabbis ask why. And they're like, the Nazirite vow is priest-light, priest-esque.
Right. Just another point for the pro-rabbi front. But yeah, I do think there's so many interesting things about Nazirite vows and the focus that we have on them as compared to broader vows. Thinking about the fact that like we have this whole book of Mishnah that lives in the order of Mishnah that is about women. That's in Nashim, right? And Nazirite vows, intriguingly, are like one of the few sort of serious spiritual practices in the time of the Mishnah that are like available to women, right? And also are relevant. I think one of the reasons this is in the book of Nashim is because there's this whole thing about women are allowed to have their vows undone by a series of people other than themselves.
Only on the first day, though.
Yeah, only on the first day. And only a certain set of people and only under a certain set of circumstances. But it is like, as I talk about the gendered side of it, I'm pulled back towards the anti-rabbi front because I'm like, this is all these women had. It was their Nazirite vows. And you took it from them, which, you know, there are multitudes contained within me, just as there are multitudes contained within the Talmud.
Rena Yehuda or Michael?
I'm just floating in vow headspace right now. Not necessarily Nazirite vows, but just thinking about what if we lived in a society where you walked into a cafe and there was a sign that said, you know, you need a vow to treat the barista this particular way. In the same way, there are signs now that said you're not allowed to open carry or closed carry if you walk into this restaurant. What if we lived in a society where we had to take vows with people that we're not necessarily ever going to see again or we don't have serious relationships with? What would that do to the quality of the interactions? I'm just thinking about the secular, liberal, philosophically based justifications for why we treat people certain ways in public. And it's like, well, we don't want to be treated poorly, so we treat them. And it's all like maybe self-oriented or like rights-oriented. I have a sneaking suspicion that if we start doing something that goes beyond that kind of secular logic and start incorporating vows into more mundane activities, like random grinder hookups, if you have to make a vow to the person about what you won't do and what you will try to do before you hook up, and that became standardized, would that change behavior? And I kind of think maybe it would, and that thought that maybe it would change things makes me think that there's a power to vows that goes beyond legal contracts or ideas about don't do harm to other people because you don't want harm done to yourself. Other types of logical frameworks for why we're moral or act civic in society. And I think that's kind of cool. It just makes me happy. The fact that I think that there is a difference in how people would act if they conceived of relationships around vows points to, you know, feeling that God is real or whatever, whatever, that's just what I'm thinking about.
This has activated some neurons within me.
Did that make any sense? I don't even know if that made sense.
No, it made a lot of sense.
I loved it.
I was thinking about, I frequently jokingly refer to myself as the only gay person who's on time anywhere. And this is like one of the ways in which the way we use words with each other can bother me internally in a way that I don't bring up a lot. But to me, like when you agree to be at a place at a time, like not doing that should be treated with some level of like seriousness, but and not, equivalent to the seriousness of the agreement. I'm not saying, we all need to be cut off from the people for being late to our Zoom appointments, but I think that there is a tendency in particularly within the progressive side of the world, but also within our culture at large, to be afraid of taking ourselves and each other seriously. The rabbis say these wild things in Talmud sometimes about like, oh, like laughter sends you to hell. Like if you laugh, like you're wicked. On one level, that is very silly, but on another level, like the level of self-deprecation and making everything light that we do within our culture at this time, I think has been actually really toxic to our ability to form meaningful relationships.
Well, you and I are in Rhode Island, so saying something's wicked, we can read it as like wicked great, wicked awesome.
Laughter it's wicked in every sense. Yeah, Rena, Yehuda.
What you're saying is so resonant. We're living in a moment where everything has to be ironic, that earnestness and seriousness and honesty is not a part of the modern dialogue. And it's frowned upon in a way that actually destroys our ability to have intersubjectivity with each other. It damages our ability to commit to things, which I think is actually at the core of why I feel so drawn to vows, is because I think commitment is extremely important. I think that the ability to uphold a certain kind of commitment and an honesty and a truth is really quite valuable. Xava, I feel such a kinship, being that I myself have often felt I am also the only gay person who can make it to a space on time. So maybe now we're the only two. But that there is this sense of really wanting to honor the commitments that we have towards each other. And culturally, I mean, as Michael was talking about, how would it change? How would it change things if we were able to really do that with each other? I was thinking about the fact that the most famous vows and oaths that we're familiar with actually directly involve the state. We have vows into enlisting into the military or swearing an oath of office. That the vows that we know how to do, the state has usurped our ability to do that with one another. That the only like real sacrosanct commitments that we're allowed to have are to these superstructures that are actually like quite violent and really impersonal. Thinking about what does it mean to take our words seriously again feels really important. There's a story about the Baal Shem Tov that I really love that, we just passed Chai Elul, so it's like, still within the Baal Shem Tov's birthday territory.
As we record this, it's a little before Rosh Hashanah. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Right. I'm always forgetting the recording timelines. Chai Elul just passed at the time of recording. And there's a story about the Baal Shem Tov that he's walking in the marketplace with a bunch of his disciples. They're walking through the marketplace and they hear a merchant getting into a fight with a customer. And the fight is starting to get like really, really nasty. And they're like hurling like slurs at each other and they're yelling and it's escalating. And finally, the merchant says to the customer, "I'm going to gut you like a fish." And at that point, the Baal Shem Tov like takes his disciples and he says, "All right, we're gonna leave. We're gonna like stop watching this because it's like not good to just stand and be a bystander. But I want to teach you all a lesson about the importance of the language that we use." And so he has them all stand in a circle and he has them put their arms around each other and he closes the circuit when he puts his hands on his disciples' shoulders. And suddenly this image is transmitted to all of them at the same time in this electric way that they all suddenly see this vision of this merchant gutting this customer like a fish. And it's incredibly gory and incredibly violent. And they all start screaming because the image is just so horrible and they can't unsee it. And finally, the Baal Shem Tov takes his hands away from the shoulders of his disciples, and he says, that's why we have to be careful about the language that we use. Because when we speak, those words actually, in other realms of creation, are happening. These are not abstract ideas. Words are not cheap. In fact, the things that we say do happen in the realm of Yetzirah, in the different realms of creation that we have access to. And for that reason, we have to guard our tongues and we have to be serious in our commitments to one another. And so when I think about something like Kol Nidre, which is a tool for saying, actually, maybe we rescind these vows because the rabbis are perhaps worried that people are actually overcommitting, I understand the hesitancy there. Because the words that we say do matter. And Xava, I really appreciate you bringing up that maybe we've become a little bit too cowardly about what does it mean to take seriously in our own words, because actually they do have the power to create the reality that we live inside.
And I think the monopolization of these vows and agreements by the state is really relevant because one of the things we're most in desperate need of these days is like a community of solidarity and mutual aid in all of our lives. And like, a necessary precondition for that to exist is to be able to rely on people to do what they say that they'll do. And unless we take our word seriously, we are sort of like degrading the possibility of that community emerging. You know, I think we can all think of a million cases in our lives when someone said, I'll be there, and they weren't there. Things happen, right? Conditions emerge, but we throw things off so easily. We throw off promises so easily that like, I think it's degrading an important foundation for creating relationships that have like the resiliency necessary to make it through times such as these.
I love state vows, by the way. I love that. I think the problem is that people don't take the state vows as seriously as they should. Maybe there should be National Guard people right now who are like, no, I guess I'm not going to do that because it goes against the vow that I took, contradicts it. I think the difference between, in my opinion, like a terrible libertarian kind of world and a more equitable socialist kind of world is people either choosing to take vows to each other collectively or not. And so, yeah. I like vows at the state level. I like vows at the individual level. Groups, harem vows. Thanks, Lex. I'm going to make a harem vow as soon as possible.
Yeah. Well, that's the key takeaway, is we should all join and create and be part of harems. That's obviously the Ikar, the core. What you just said, Michael, is like really, it feels so resonant, I think. And the power of words that Xava and Rena Yehuda, you talked about, that's unbelievably key. I mean, when I officiate weddings, you know, context with vows, but also like I would add that in addition to state vows, there are also vows where religiously authorized figures are sometimes delivering them. And I think, for example, of the pronouncement, like legally at a wedding, the person officiating, who by law, according to the state, can either be certain kinds of justices of the peace or whatever, or a clergy person, they have to say, by the power vested in me by insert state, I now pronounce you married, husband and wife, whatever, husband and husband, wife, wife. And that's a vow. And Michael, you're right. I think people don't really think about it as a vow. They don't think that like something is happening in that moment that changes the status of the world or of that relationship. I try to take it seriously, and I say, by the power of this gathered community and the state of whatever, because I'm required, like the couple wants me to say the state because that's the rule. Some of them have told me not to because they're similarly rebellious, which is great. But like, I think that the ways vows push us to consider our words, because Jewish vows, we didn't actually say this, all of them only exist through speech. There's no such thing as like you write down something and you become obligated to a vow. That doesn't exist. There's no other way to instantiate one. And so by their nature, they push us to think about our words, which is really important. And also by their nature with the Nazirite vow, like when I was a Nazirite, there were moments where there'd be like the fruit plate at whatever thing, and it's got grapes. And I remember there was one moment where like for some reason grapes were being passed around a room. It wasn't a Jewish room. And I had to say to the room, oh, I'm sorry, I actually can't have these grapes. And they're like, oh, you're allergic? And I'm like, it's hard to explain. It's a long thing, but like, I can't have these grapes. And now, is that a deeply spiritual, is that like a really important act in and of itself? I don't think so. Is having religious practices on an individual and communal level where we actively differentiate ourselves from the room, like, is that important? Yes, I do think it's important. I think in a time where, like you said, Michael, if people were taking their vows seriously, we'd have people in the Coast Guard and people in all sorts of state agencies saying, you know what, I am going to speak out and I'm going to not follow the order that I'm being given right now. I think a way to get us there, and not just like state apparatus, like people in employment situations being asked to do all sorts of oppressive things. Like if all of us had practices where part of our daily life was actually having to say, oh, sorry, like I'm not going to drink that wine. It's a whole thing, but like, I think it pushes us to be able to do that in the situations where it's more important. It's like why I keep kosher. Like I don't think that the foods I don't eat are inherently worse than other foods. It's just I think that it is worthwhile to care about what goes into my mouth because it encourages me to care about the little moments and the little things in my life that blur into bigger things. And I think with vows, it's another practice where we can really achieve that. And in a world that needs folks to stand out from the crowd and to stand against all forms of systematic kinds of harm, this vow and others could help us.
Lex, I'm really crazy about your use of the word practice here. Like I really like thinking about this as being practice, and practice for what? Practice for geula, practice for redemption. That I've often, like for a long time, like I've said, the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael is really important because if you can't practice
of loving other Jews, yeah,
right, the practice of Ahavat Yisrael, the unconditional love of other Jews, which frankly these days feels very, very difficult for me, that if you can't practice that with 0.02% of the population, how are you going to do solidarity at a big scale? And thinking about vows and oaths as being practice for the world that we're trying to build, practice for Olam Haba, that's a really, really interesting, and it feels like a meaningful highlight about why would you abstain from grapes in this small moment, is like practicing being non-conforming in a way that's really, really low stakes, for that actually when the high stakes thing knocks on your door that actually like might be a life or death situation, you're not so nervous about doing something that breaks the fray. And I think it's also interesting thinking about the ways that sometimes there are vows. Many of the vows I think that we encounter within Mishnaic and Talmudic contexts are vows of abstention, saying, I won't do this thing, I remove myself from this thing. And there are certain rabbinic definitions of vows that actually say that it is actually about abstaining from something. And thinking, what does it mean then to also have vows too? Vows of commitment towards something in the positive. I will do this thing rather than I will abstain from this. And what muscles do both of those kinds of vows stretch in terms of this practicing for the world to come?
This is making me feel a lot better as a generally sad person, I would say. You know, just my baseline is sort of like what you hear. I don't think I need to explain. I think it comes through pretty clearly to regular listeners or to anyone who just hears 3 seconds of my voice and mannerism. There is something about vows. It almost feels like a preparation for death, like you're sublimating yourself into the cosmic goop with other people. Either because you're doing a vow, like a Nazarite vow, that's like kind of, you know, you could say is about you, but, you know, you're part of a long history of other people who've done it in the past or could have done it in the past theoretically, or maybe you have a community of people you're doing it with, or you're actually doing vows to specific people, like a marriage is the typical where you really are sublimating yourself into something else. Which I know, Xava, you and I are in agreement that, like, you know, we're all part of the same cosmic goop, so it's a daily reminder if you have these vows to be aware of that higher metaphysical reality and, you know, takes the edge off death. And it makes me think that, like, the opposite of doing vows is kind of, like, if I think about what is, like, a monster who is the opposite of vows. If you were to create a horror movie with a representative monster, it'd be a person who's afraid of everyone and doesn't want to engage with anyone, is always trying to get a better deal out of someone. Some sort of weird, selfish, narcissistic monster is almost like the personification or the monsterification of something that's against vows. And I don't want to be that way. I don't think anyone does, or hopefully. So yeah, I don't know. Go out there and get married, people. Take a vow. Any old vow will do.
And other vows.
I think for my last thought, I'll just say as the resident Jew boo that Buddhism has a huge vow practice that's very much alive, right? I mean, part of the nightly chanting of most or many flavors of Buddhism, at least the one that I studied in, are these things called the four bodhisattva vows, which go, sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Desires are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. The Dharma is boundless, I vow to master it. The Buddha way is unattainable, I vow to attain it. And this is just like repeated night after night forever. And this is just one of many vows. Like when you're becoming an official Buddhist, like the equivalent of a Buddhist bat mitzvah, at least in the Zen tradition, you do something called taking the precepts, which is basically where you like vow to follow the basic ethical precepts, like not murdering and stuff like that. These take the form of vows, which one, I just think like love that practice is alive and well, but also it sort of made me think that we're sort of haven't even addressed the fact that like all of Judaism occurs in the context of a vow, which is like a covenant that we made with God. This is like all vows are like conditional on this one big vow, a harem vow, you might say.
And arguably, according to the rabbis, a vow under duress. They actually tackle that. I think you've talked about that on the show before.
Mm-hmm. But I think there's something, this is like starting a million other conversations, but I think many Jews born as Jews are missing something that Buddhists who take the precepts get to take, which is like a moment of agreeing to the system in which you're taking part, rather than sort of just experiencing it as the atmosphere that you breathe. And so taking vows feels like this very funny thing, but like you are actually already in a vow. And that's like a huge experience that I think many Jews don't offer themselves, that like, for instance, converts get to have and get to model for the rest of us, which is like choosing to become a part of that vow. And I think we should all be aware that like we choose to fulfill or not fulfill it. Like we also, whether you're born a Jew or not born a Jew, you have a choice about whether to take part in that vow. And we just need to be more conscious of that and offer ourselves the gift of vow practice within Judaism.
The power of choice and vows feels really resonant in a moment in human history that feels like it is constantly Purim, that things are upside down and topsy-turvy and good is evil and evil is good, that we often say that Purim is the time in which Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, actually claim independently their covenant with God. That instead of it being under duress like it was at Mount Sinai, that Purim, in the absence or the hiding of Hashem from the story, that God isn't in the Megillah, that's actually the point at which we make that choice. And the choice is that much holier because we're doing it out of that freedom. And Xava, I love what you were saying about the importance of choice and vows. And it really feels like in this moment that all things feel like Purim, how much more so is it valuable that we make vows out of our own freedom and out of our own desire.
What a gorgeous set of notes to end on. I'm really grateful to y'all, Michael and Xava, for hosting Rena Yehuda. And I am also grateful to Rena Yehuda for being a thought partner here and always. We're going to close things out, and as we do so, just maybe we should, I mean, I'm not going to do it officially with the particular Hebrew words, like maybe we could model this by, making some kind of vow commitment to one another in the podosphere and figuring like we've hung out a few times, we've done collab episodes, we've been in touch. Xava, you've taught a class with us here. Like maybe we want to think about what it would look like for us to like envision our dream connection to one another and make a vow around that. So we won't do it now, but just for the future. But in the spirit of that and in the interest of that, we hope that those of you who are here from the Chai How Are You side will check out Judaism Unbound. It's weird for me to say that, but like we'd love for you to check out our work, JudaismUnbound.com, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'll say to the folks coming here primarily from the Judaism Unbound side is y'all should absolutely voraciously, as I do, listen to as many episodes of Chai How Are You as you can. It is XAI for Chai, just as Xava spells her name XAVA. That's how you find it. I say that just so that you don't have a tough time finding it as you Google. But do Google. Do go to Chai How Are You and all the podcast apps and stay tuned for the work that they're doing. I've so thoroughly enjoyed your episodes on Nazareth, but also far beyond that. Whenever I have long drives, I tend to binge like 6 of your episodes in a row and do that not live tweeting that Xava's describing to Xava. So strong endorsement of that practice. But thank you so much for listening. We hope that there will be, as we said, future versions of this collab. But with that, this has been
Hi, how are you?
and Judaism Unbound.